Good morning, everybody. So that's how I spell my name. Excellent. Right. I have to apologize right from the start. My Bulgarian is not very good. But I do know the most important phrase in Bulgarian, which is Dve bili moria. Moyat priatel ste plati. That's all you need to know. So any of you hear me saying that, you two guys look like likely candidates in the front row there. I'll be expecting you to get your money out and buy me 2 beers. But it's lovely to be here, partly because my partner in crime, the dreaded James May from Top Gear, is in London. He is the bane of my life. He seems to think, because we do television shows together, that I will always want to have a drink with him. He turns up at my house and goes, "Hello, I thought you might want someone to have a drink with you." And you say, No, James, I really don't. Well, shall I come in then? No, please. No, don't come in. All right, then I'll just come in. In he comes, and I think, I've got a deadline. Midnight tonight, it's never going to... Editors now give me 2 extra days because they know James May will turn up. He will drink 3 bottles of wine. I shall probably drink the best part of 3 bottles of wine. We'll get no work done. But he did actually give me one good piece of advice. He said, never talk in public for longer than you can make love. Thank you. Oh, the idea of putting the words James May and making love in the same sentence is just too horrible to contemplate. So, people often ask me how I got involved in this wine business. Well, you've got to start young. And I started drinking when I was 3. I remember we were having a picnic by the side of the river. My brother was drowning in the river. My mother was having hysterics. My father was trying to rescue my brother. And I saw this bottle of my mother's damson wine on the side of the rug. So nobody was looking, so I drank it. Delicious. Actually, my brother did survive. I very nearly didn't. My father dragged one son out of the river, then saw this other son looking all pink and comatose, saw the empty bottle of damson wine, so he picked me up by the ankles, whacked me in the stomach, and all the damson wine exited my body whence it had entered my body. And actually, it's interesting. I've always rather liked wines ever since then that tasted of damsons. Things like Argentine Malbecs taste of damsons. And also, of course, I know that they taste just as good on the way back up as they did on the way down, which is important with wine. So that really put me off drinking till I was about 18 years old. Well, almost. What's the next drinking I did? Firstly, I didn't go to school till I was 6. I don't know why. I think my mother thought my father was going to send me to school. My father thought my mother was going to send me to school. Now, my mother was a Catholic. My father was a Protestant. And Catholics are very fierce about education. And I do remember one day my father coming back and saying, "Well, have we found a school for Robert yet?" Robert, my name is Robert, by the way, not Oz. There are many other secrets about me, some of which will come out in the next half an hour. And my mother said, "I have found a school for Robert." She's Irish, if that's an Irish accent. And my dad said, "Oh, which school is that?" And she said, "St. Anne's Convent." And my dad said, "But that's a girls' school." And my mother said, "Yes, but it's a Catholic girls' school." So I went to a girls' school. It was wonderful. There was I, 6 years old. I have never had so much attention from 16-year-old girls. They queued up to walk me home. When I was 16, no 16-year-old girls would talk to me, but when I was 6, they queued up to walk me home. But until then, this is where people think, how did I get involved in the world of taste and flavors? Well, until I was 6, we lived out in the country and we were self-sufficient. We grew our own vegetables, we grew our own fruit, we raised chickens, and we had a pig and we had some ducks. Everything was done. So since I wasn't at school, my father was off working, I was my mother's little helper all the time. I was the one who went and cut the carrots. I was the one who went and checked whether the cabbage was ready or whether the lettuce was ripe, whether the potatoes were ready to cook, whether the apples were ready, which particular pear tree was ripe, bringing all this stuff in to the kitchen where my mother cooked them and made jams and chutneys and pickles and stews and pies and tarts and cakes. That was my life, day by day by day. Flavors, 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 flavors. And it's always stayed with me, that sense that I'm the kind of person, each morning I get up and I taste the tap water. I taste everything. You know, I go down to the hotel for breakfast, and they've got 4 or 5 different sorts of milk. And there am I, standing there tasting all these different sorts of milk, and the waiter's going, I know, he was here yesterday, we can't get rid of him. But anyway, he's quite harmless. But I love taste, and it comes from that fact that when I should have been in school learning mathematics, I wasn't. I was in the kitchen with my mum cooking, and everything about flavor, everything about perfumes, all that love of flavor comes from my good old mum. But we weren't drinking. We didn't drink wine at home. We didn't drink. My father drank. We had 2 bottles of wine a year. 1 bottle of Hungarian bull's blood and 1 bottle of Lutimer Riesling from Yugoslavia. So those are 2 ancient names which you may or may not have had to cope with in Bulgaria. Probably not. They were from your neighbors just over that way. We didn't drink at home. But actually, the Archbishop of Canterbury was the only person who offered me a drink. Because when we went carol singing, the Archbishop, all the other people would give us tea, but the Archbishop, in his palace at Canterbury Cathedral, we'd always come in cold and shivery after singing carols in the icy precincts. There'd be a tray of glistening golden liquid, and that would be a tray of ginger wine. And we'd always have glasses of ginger wine. And we sang brilliantly, if erratically, after our glasses of ginger wine. And the other time, oh God, the memory, my first communion, I'm ashamed to this day, but it shows the kind of life I was going to lead. I remember at the first communion, there was the Archbishop of Canterbury giving me my first communion, and I took the chalice, and I had a little sip of this communion wine, and I thought, that's good, and I went to give myself another sip, with the Archbishop of Canterbury saying, excuse me, you only have 1 sip, this is your first communion, now behave yourself. Anyway, so I really didn't have anything to do with alcohol until I went to university. I went up to university. Well, I knew exactly what I wanted. Sex. But I had absolutely no idea how to get it. I went to a boys' school, having gone to the girls' school initially. Then I went to a boys' school. In either way, I wasn't having any luck. All my teenage years were spent trying to get a girlfriend and failing to get a girlfriend. Went up to university and thought, surely I'll be able to get a girlfriend at university. But I had no money. And I looked through the university handbook, and I saw that there was a university wine tasting club. It was sponsored by the university, so it was the equivalent of 1 lev a tasting, and there were 4 tastings a term. So for 4 lev, I got 4 wine tastings. And then I saw the small print at the bottom and it said, "And you can take a guest." And suddenly, one lev for a wine tasting became one lev for a date. And I absolutely remember the first ever wine tasting I did. Her name was Francesca. And she was green from top to bottom. She had green hair. She had green sequins all over her face. She had a very skimpy green top on. She had a tiny green leather dress. And the rest of her, which was frankly most of her, was covered in green body paint. This was my first wine tasting. I put on my smart jeans and a shirt. I had a shirt, knocked on this grand door in Oxford University. It was opened by a person in a pinstripe suit. Everyone else in that room was male and was wearing a pinstripe suit. I was wearing jeans and a shirt, and I was with a girl who was green from top to bottom. Now, my attempts to get a girlfriend weren't successful. She left before the end of the tasting. I took 3 more girls to tasting that term. None of them ever spoke to me ever again. It's quite clear to me that wine tasting was just about the most boring thing that a teenage girl could possibly be asked to do. But I thought my social life is still going nowhere. But I really got this idea of flavors again. And I absolutely just clicked straight away into wine flavors. And luckily, I immediately, maybe going back to all the years I'd spent with my mum in her kitchen, I found I could put them into words. Now, lots of people are really good wine tasters, but can't actually put it into words. Putting it into words is really quite difficult. And I always say to people, wine taste with your friends, chat, talk. Because just by yourself, it's quite hard work to think, what is that flavor? But I found, luckily, I could do it. And talking about the wine tasting, the first ever wine tasting was Bordeaux red wine. And I absolutely remember the final wine. They obviously said, let's get something old to give a treat to the young kids. And it was a bottle of Chateau Léoville Barton, which is a wonderful Bordeaux wine made by an Irishman, 1962. As soon as I say that, I've got the flavor in my head again. It was so dry. It had an amazing smell of things like cedarwood and cigar boxes. And you put it in your mouth, and this dryness had a piercing blackcurrant flavor to it, but no sugar. It was just the essence of blackcurrant, and it was as though a dragon had sucked all the sweetness out of the blackcurrant and just left the essence of this blackcurrant flavor and mixed it with cigar smoke and cedarwood and cigar boxes. And I just thought, that is truly astonishing. And any of you who know those old Bordeaux's from those days, it's a memorable flavor. That was my first ever wine tasting. So the point is that I very quickly thought, I'm going to enjoy the wine tasting, even if it wasn't doing much for my social life. But the second term, and by this time I had done 5 wine tastings, I'd borrowed my mother's car, and there was a knock on the door, and this big, this pork pie of a bloke turned up and said, "Hello, have you got a car?" And I went, yes. And he said, "Congratulations, you're in the university wine tasting team. Now drive to the television studios, ITV television studios in Birmingham. You're doing a blind wine tasting live on television at 6 o'clock tonight." And I thought, I've only been to 5 wine tastings. I've never done a blind tasting, but you can say no, or you can just say right. And I know what had happened. The popular newspapers wanted to make fun of us Oxford types and our wine tasting and how smart and pompous we all were. And they'd chosen Big Fat Roger, he had more sense. He said, let's get that new squit, that keen one. He'll do it. And so I got in this car and I drove up to Birmingham to ITV Studios. And this was the most important current affairs show of the week, ITV's 6 o'clock show. And I turned up there. And I was early, so I went down to the canteen. And I looked at the food, and then I said, oh, they've got a wine list. And the wine list was 6 or 7 wines long, and there was a muscadet on it. I thought, oh, muscadet, God, I know what that is. Like, it tastes of nothing. It's bone dry and tastes of nothing. I thought, right. And they've got a Nierstein. I thought, oh, God, Nierstein. That's slightly sweet and smells of vomit. Okay, ugh. And there was something like a Suave there. And then the red wines, there was a Rioja. And I thought, oh, Rioja, yes, that's that rather pale wine. That's really quite nice. And then there was an old 5-year-old Beaujolais. I thought, really weird. I bet that's all brown and stale. I then walked out onto this studio, and clearly, and cameras on you and everybody, and the interviewers were clearly thinking, he's going to be hopeless. We're going to mercilessly make fun of him and kick him off back down to Oxford University. And they said, okay, there were 4 wines, 2 white and 2 red there. And I thought, Jesus, here we go. And I just kept thinking, if you've tasted it in the last 5 tastings, you'll remember it. And otherwise, just keep your mind on the flavors, what you know, your first impressions. I picked up the first glass and I smelt it and I thought, God, it smells of absolutely nothing. And I tasted it and I thought, oh, God, bone dry, absolutely nothing. I went, hang on, the canteen wine list. And I went, yes, that doesn't taste of anything, very dry, blah, blah, blah. I think this is a muscadet. And they went, absolutely amazing. Yes, it's a muscadet. And the next one, I picked it up, and it smelt of vomit. And I thought, it's the Niersteiner from the canteen wine list. And I tasted it, and it was slightly sweet and tasted of vomit. So I went, blah, blah, blah. I think this is a Niersteiner. And they went, absolutely amazing. Yes, it's a Niersteiner. The red, I picked the red up, and I thought, it's quite pale. It'll be that Rioja, I thought. It's the Rioja. I tasted it. It was nice and smooth. I said, yes. And I kept thinking, the wine list. It's the canteen wine list. All they've done is go and get the wines from the canteen wine list. This has got to be Rioja. So I said, I think this is from Spain. I think this is Rioja. And they went, absolutely amazing. He's got 3 wines, 100% right. The 4th one looked a bit brown. And I thought, I know what it is. I know it's the old Beaujolais. But I thought, it's such an unusual wine. I can't say it's an old Beaujolais because they'll think, hang on, he knows these are from the canteen wine list. So I said, oh, it's an old Burgundy. And they went, ha, 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 no, it's an old Beaujolais. And I thought, I know it's an old Beaujolais, but I can't say it because I'm desperately keen to be thought of as a genius, not as someone who's just read the canteen wine list. So I left the studio, and I thought I would go back to university, and everyone would say, "Whoa, fantastic, well done." Complete silence, because their whole objective had been to actually take the piss. But blind wine tasting, I thought, on television, I really liked the idea of the flavors, but I liked the idea of the showbiz. And I just thought, beginning to think already, there's a career here. And so what we then did back at university was we decided, we always got beaten in wine tasting competitions by people who went to smarter places, had more money, drank expensive wines. We didn't. So we decided the way to teach ourselves to wine taste was do it ourselves. And so we had a group of 6 or 8 of us, and each week we had to buy a bottle, any old bottle, shove it in a brown paper bag, bring it along, pour it out, and everybody had to say what they thought it tasted of. Write it down, because it's amazing how quickly you forget things when you've had a glass or 2 of wine. Everybody had to write down what they thought the wine was. Then we would take it out of the brown paper bag. Look at that label, Bordeaux or Beaujolais or Chianti or whatever. Look at the label, read it. Taste the wine again. So this is what Chianti tastes like, or this is what Beaujolais tastes like. This is what proper German wine tastes like. Get it again. Look at the label. Taste it again. Put it down on paper. And that's how we taught ourselves. We didn't have any expensive patrons at all. We absolutely taught ourselves how to taste wine. And to this day, when I'm teaching people about wine tasting, I say, you've got to go back to your own life, your own emotions, your own impressions. And that's the only way really to learn about wine. You can read books and things till the cows come home. But the way to do it is look at your own life. For instance, black currants. Just saying, oh, this wine tastes of black currants. That might help. But what about if you say, I know what black currants these are. These are the black currants that my mother made into that fantastic jam. And the first jar she opened, and there was a great plike of white bread there, and slathered with salty butter. And then we shoved the blackcurrant jam on. And that was the first blackcurrant jam of the year. That's how you remember what blackcurrants are like, not just saying, oh, a blackcurrant. You remember it by saying, I had the experience of this actual blackcurrant jam. And that way, if you put it to your own emotions, your own memories, you can remember stuff all your life if you use your own life and your own memories and your own experiences to help. So I then thought, well, if the wine tasting thing, if I'm any good at this, I thought I'd better try again. And there was a national wine tasting competition. And I entered it, and everyone said, oh, you're a student, you can't enter that. You'll never get the questions right. And I thought, well, I won't know until I try. And I came second in the national wine tasting competition. It was wonderful. It shows innocent times. The person who came third was the Director General of the BBC, and the person who came fourth was Britain's Foreign Secretary. Imagine the Foreign Secretary saying, oh, sorry, Prime Minister, just going to pop along and do a bit of wine tasting. Sorry, there's a war on, is there? Where's the war? Oh, the war can wait till tomorrow. I've really got to do some wine tasting, old chap. That's what it was. Innocent times. But I managed to come second in this wine tasting, and people said, you can't come second. You're not old enough to know about wine. And I just thought, well, I think I probably am. And again, it's when you're talking about wine tasting, it's great to be older and have lots of experience, but you don't have to be. You can be really young and be really good at wine tasting, so long as your mind's on it. It's not, age and experience are great, but they're just one extra thing. Youth is just as good as experience when it comes to wine tasting. So I eventually found myself thinking, I need a career. And my parents were expecting me to become a dry cleaner. I thought I really don't want to become a dry cleaner. And I'd found out about acting, and I'd managed to get into enough acting shows. My final show at Oxford, for those of you who know Shakespeare, was a very suitable one. It was Twelfth Night, and I was playing Sir Toby Belch, which was just, I couldn't have had a better part to finish my Oxford career on. And I then went off and became an actor. And while I was an actor, they started this thing called the English Wine Tasting Team. I don't know why I'm drinking water. There's some perfectly good wine here. Oh, blind tasting. Yes, it's a blind tasting. That one's white, that one's pink, and that one's red. Blind tasting is really simple. Just, got them. I got them 100% right. Whatever that is, lovely. So they got this English wine tasting team together. And I was playing Dracula in Sheffield at the time. And I got this message from a friend in London saying, we've got a wine tasting team. They're doing auditions. They're doing tastings. So I went down to London. I got into the team. And our first match was against the French. We threw down this gauntlet saying, we, the English wine tasting team, will taste against any country your wines in your place we'll come and taste your wines, and we'll beat you. We thought, we'll beat everybody, we thought. And everyone thought, we will beat the English. So the first people were the French, and there's nothing the French like more than beating the English. So they had hired this enormous palace in Paris, and got all this great wine tasting set out. They had got television crews from as far away as Japan to come in to this, to see France humiliate the old enemy, England, the old enemy. We absolutely walloped them. We completely walloped the French. We got the first, second, third, fourth, and sixth places out of 10. And so the next day, Le Figaro, which is the most famous newspaper in France, for only the second time since the Second World War, and the first time was when General de Gaulle died, they framed the front page of Le Figaro in black, because they said it was so shameful for the French to lose at wine tasting to the ignorant English. And it was wonderful because, of course, the English newspapers absolutely loved it. The idea that we could go to France and win. And so I came back excited. I was at the National Theatre at the time. I was singing a show. And the other guys were accountants and lawyers and things. So the newspapers all said, hey, there's an actor, get a photograph of the actor. So I was on the front page of all the newspapers as this actor who had just been wine tasting in France and beaten the French. And this is how it then started developing. I remember the next year, the Germans took up the challenge. We went to Germany. We tasted against Germany. We beat the Germans as well. And at that time, by that time, I was playing Sweeney Todd in Drury Lane. I don't know whether any of you know Stephen Sondheim's Sweeney Todd. There was a barber and his wife, and she was beautiful. A foolish barber and his wife, she was his meaning and his life, and she was beautiful, and she was virtuous, and he was naive. And at that moment, Tobias Ragg comes along, cuts my throat, and you fall to the floor. And I remember this so much because the day I came back from Germany, having just won the tasting match, then all the newspapers taking photographs of me doing my barber stuff, then going out on stage and singing Sweeney Todd. I just thought, when is life going to get serious? If this is what adult life is supposed to be like, it's brilliant. But of course, what I really meant was, it looks as though I may never have to grow up. If you can go on leading lives like this, you won't have to grow up. Well, the next year we were doing. Oh yes, the next year we tasted against the Italians, and we beat the Italians. And I was doing another show called the Mitford Girls, but I was also recording the music for the Lord of the Rings. I don't know whether you know the first Lord of the Rings. What was it? Gil-galad was an elven king, of him the ancients often sing. The land he ruled was fair and free, between the mountains and the sea. That's Sam Ganji's song from the thing. And so that was happening. We did the Italians. The next one, the Americans said, well, we'll take the guys on. And so we were tasting against the Americans. And I was playing General Perron in Evita by this time. And each time, here we go. But on the other hand, she's all they've got. She's a diamond in their dull grey lives, and that's the hardest kind of stone. It usually survives. And when you think about it, can you recall the last time they loved anyone at all? That's General Perron talking about Evita. And we beat the Americans. I was, again, on the front page of the this time, General Perron doing his wine tasting. Honestly, I tell you, it was completely unreal. But it meant that everybody knew that there was an actor who knew about wine. And BBC was starting a new show called Food and Drink. And they decided that they wanted to do what they said was the first ever blind wine tasting live on television ever done. And the guy who was going to do it dropped out 24 hours before. I don't blame him. He got a fatal disease, which he miraculously recovered from 2 days later, of course. But he just thought, I'm not going to do that in front of a camera. And the director just said, there's an actor who knows about wine. Get me the actor who knows about wine. Didn't know what my name was. He said, there's an actor. We've seen him in the newspapers. Get that actor. Get him on the studio here. We've got to have him tomorrow for this wine tasting. And I got the message at the stage door. Are you free tomorrow to do a wine tasting? And you know, young actor asked to do a show on BBC Prime Time. I said, yeah, absolutely. I'll make sure I can get down there. But I had a bit of a cold at the time, and I remember thinking, I've got to do this. I've got to do this. I turned up to the studio, and the director said, this is the first ever blind wine tasting live done in public on television. And I thought, no, it's not. It's the second. I've done one of these already, but he didn't know about it. And so, and I said, thinking I had a bit of a cold, I thought, I won't be able to taste these wines properly. And I said, hang on, do the audience know what the wines are? And he said, oh yes, the audience will know, because there'll be a big board up like that, but you can't see the board, so you won't know. And I just thought, I've done pantomime. I reckon I can do this. And I went out and I looked at the wines there, and I saw this glass of thick golden liquid. Now, this was when there was only 2 Australian wines on the English market at that time. They were called VAT 47 from Tyrrell's Chardonnay and Rosemount Estate Chardonnay. Those were the only 2 Australian wines available in England. And I looked and I just thought, that golden colour, that's got to be the Australian Chardonnay, which I'd had at some tasting or other. I'd had it at a Waitrose tasting. Waitrose is one of our supermarkets. I thought, that's got to be that Tyrrell's VAT 47 Chardonnay. So I went on stage and I started looking, I said, look at that colour. Must be from somewhere quite warm. Little ripple in the audience. I thought, it's the Australian Chardonnay. So I then said, France is quite warm. Silence. But I said, I don't think it's French. Spain is quite warm. Silence. No. I said, I think the southern hemisphere is a bit warmer than the northern hemisphere. Little ripple in the audience. I thought, it's the Australian Chardonnay. And eventually I said, well, South Africa is quite hot. New Zealand, silence, isn't very hot. Australia, little ripple. It's the Australian Chardonnay. So I said, I think this wine's Australian. And they went, oh, absolutely, yes, it's Australian. I said, what about grape varieties? Now, they're thinking, the Riesling, silence, isn't very golden. The Sauvignon Blanc, silence, isn't very golden. Now, the Chardonnay, little ripple again in the audience. It's the Australian Chardonnay. And I went on through eventually, as I said to the guy, I think this wine is called VAT 47. It's made by a bloke called Murray Tyrrell. He's got a moustache, his wife's got a moustache, his dog's got a moustache. It's from the Hunter Valley, just north of Sydney in New South Wales, and you can get it for £5.99 at Waitrose. And everyone applauded like mad. And I went off thinking, God, that was fantastic fun. And the producer said, I had no idea that wine tasting could be showbiz like this. And he said, would you like to become a regular on the show? And I said, oh, absolutely would I. Certainly would. And he said, fantastic. Next series, you're a regular on the show. And he said, oh, one thing, by the way. Do you realize you forgot to taste the wine? Forgot to taste the wine. I've been so busy doing the pantomime, completely forgot to taste the wine. So honestly, you can make yourself a great reputation, well, in very dubious ways. We had a world wine tasting competition, which I actually won. And I kept going to New York, business class flights to New York, business class flights to Dallas, business class flights to San Francisco. And we ended up in Los Angeles, and I kept doing these tasting semi-finals and things. We ended up in Los Angeles. We went to the beach at Santa Monica, the beach. the final, this is America for you, the final of the World Wine Tasting Championship was held on the beach at Santa Monica. And I must admit, I still remember the final wine, which I got right. And I have a feeling I may have got it right because everybody else there basically was Japanese. And I don't think they could read the questions. And I could read the questions. I understood what was going on. I don't think they knew what was going on. So I just said, "Oh, it's a Carraro Ferrani, whatever it was, Gewürztraminer from the Napa Valley," just making a bit of a guess on it, and it was. And I think I won by default. So I mean, you need luck in life, and I must admit, the luck I've had, I'm completely delighted to have had it. But the same thing about writing about wine. Because of the wine tasting team, basically wine writers in the old days, when there were wine writers, there are very few nowadays, there are wine critics, which is a completely different thing. But wine writers, they would normally be some old man, normally, occasionally a woman, who'd been the foreign correspondent or who'd been the home affairs correspondent, and they get to about 65 and they keep thinking, well, he's a nice old chap and he likes a good lunch. Why don't we make him into the wine correspondent? And that's what wine correspondents were. They weren't experts. And they just told you what a jolly good lunch they'd had and another jolly good lunch and how they were getting fatter and fatter and fatter. That's all they told you about in the old days. When I had it was the German one again. That was a good year when we did the Germans. I got back having done that, and I got a call from the Sunday Express, a big newspaper, to come in and see them. And they said, "You seem to know about wine. Would you like to be our wine writer?" And I just thought, again, you can say yes or no. What he said, "Can you write?" The editor said, "Can you write?" And again, you can either say yes or you can say no. I hadn't written anything yet, but of course I thought, I'm sure I can write. So I said, "Yes, I can write." He said, "Excellent. Would you like to be our wine writer?" And I just thought, I'm in the West End doing Sweeney Todd. I'm now a wine writer. Honestly, you did think, when is real life going to kick in? And I still sometimes wonder when real life will kick in, because I'm still singing. I do about 10 concerts a year at the moment with my friend James May. We've got a new one next year on Johann Sebastian Bach, because he says that Johann Sebastian Bach never wrote a bad note of music. I say yes, he did. So the show is about me proving that some Bach is pretty frightful, and him proving that Bach is always brilliant. So that's what we're doing next year. There'll be wine in it, because most of the concerts we do, we make the audience drink wine while they're listening to the concert. It works really well. And we've got another one called Gin and Phonic, which is basically the relationship between gin and music, which is tremendous. And we've got another one called Alleluia, which is the relationship between beer and music. They're all great fun. And everyone gets slightly clattered and has a wonderful time, and I have to do a bit of singing and God knows what. But that world that I came into, that wine world, I mean, what was it like? It was grim. It was a miserable kind of wine world. For a start, as you guys will know, there was the USSR. The whole of this eastern part of Europe was part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which meant that the wine was... I went to Russia once or twice. I had tasted one or two nomenclatura wines, which were remarkably good. Presumably the best stuff that got made got nicked by the top boys in Moscow and said, "We'll have that." But the stuff that you could buy in the street in Moscow was absolutely foul. And that's the world we had in Britain was unspeakable muck coming from the dregs, the scrapings of the barrels of the least ripe wines on the Mediterranean. Terrible rubbish from southern France, terrible rubbish from Italy, terrible rubbish from Spain. But there was one bright spark in this grim world of wine, and that was a kind of new world before we even knew what the new world was. And that was Bulgaria. unbelievably, Bulgaria began the New World wine revolution in Northern Europe, because we had no Australia, we had no Chile, we had no Argentina, we had no South Africa, we had no New Zealand. But Bulgaria, even in those communist days, was obeying one of the first rules of the New World, and that is, give the wine drinkers what they want. Now, that may sound obvious, but it wasn't. The people in France, they gave us loads of wine. It was filthy. They wouldn't drink it themselves. They said, oh, the Brits will have that. The people in Spain, the people in Italy, to be honest, I don't think they knew how to actually make good wine. And this whole thing of a concept of, I'm a winemaker. Shall I make something that the wine drinker might enjoy? That's a new concept. It sounds bizarre, but it's a modern concept. And the first people who did that were Bulgaria. And it was basically giving us what we really craved, which was fruit and ripeness. And we wanted the Sukhindol Cabernet Sauvignon. We wanted the Sakar Mountain Cabernet. We wanted the Schwichthof Cabernet Sauvignon. We wanted the Oryachowitzer Cabernet Sauvignon. We wanted the Haskovo Merlot and the Asinovgrad Mavrud. We even wanted the Cancrum Chardonnay. And in Northern Europe, we actually thought these wines were wonderful. And I know that when privatization came along and the socialist republics were swept away, Bulgaria had quite a tough time in the wine world working out how to react. But I'm talking here about that time up to the early 1990s, when Bulgaria was the site of the New World, which was giving British wine drinkers a glimpse of fruit, a glimpse of pleasure. Because what does New World mean? It means, you might say it's a place. Well, nowadays, perhaps it is. But if I'm saying that Bulgaria was our first sign of New World, Bulgaria is not normally regarded as a New World place. But maybe it's a New World state of mind. Because the New World is about having no traditions. Traditions are often like the corset for the next generation. One generation says, this is how they did it then, and this is how we have to do it. Instead of thinking, no, but I don't want to do it like that. It's this wonderful thing of, we have been making wine for 600 years, and if you don't like it, that's not our problem. That's the German view, anyway. But that kind of tradition really gets in the way. Most traditions actually need re-evaluating all the time, particularly in the world of wine. It means no rules. The rules, basically, which most winemakers have to cope with, are incredibly restrictive. They're not. French appellation contrôlée, Italian denominazione di origine, all these things, they weren't put in place to help people make better wine. They were put in place to stop people cheating. The appellation contrôlée in France is run by the Directorate for the Suppression of Fraud. That's who runs the appellation contrôlée, not the Directorate for the Improvement of Wine. No, it's the Directorate for the Suppression of Fraud. So, if I was, let's say, in Bordeaux, and I said, I think this bit of vineyard here would make a really nice white wine from the Riesling grape. And I would say, I want to plant Riesling, and the guy would say, you cannot do that. I said, no, it'll be really good. You cannot do it. No, it'll work. I'll make a really nice wine, but you can't do it. And you say, well, why can't I? But because you can't. And then you say, okay, well, all right. This bit of land here, I think, is actually better than this bit of land here. So do you mind if I plant that one there? No, you can't do that. No, this bit's better. But it's not classified. You cannot do that. Yeah, but it's better. Can I plant it? No, you cannot. Why not? Because you cannot. I mean, okay. I want to make a sparkling wine here instead of a red wine. You can't do that. But I can sell it. I'll make really good sparkling wine. I don't care. You cannot do that. That's the way that France, Italy, and Germany were the ones that suffered most from that. These rules. The New World approach is don't make any rules to restrict us. Basically, you don't want to go around poisoning people, but as long as you're not poisoning people, let the market decide. Let you guys decide what works, what doesn't work. What else is the New World about? It's about democratization, because most wine has been an attempt, most good wine, until the New World approach, the New World mindset, most good wine was about exclusivity, was about making sure that as few people as possible drank the good stuff and the rubbish was drunk by everybody else. Certainly when I started doing wine television with my batty blonde Gilly Goulden, who I did the BBC Food and Drink with, and we were having about 11 or 12 million viewers a week on that television show, telling people in simple, brazen, idiotic sometimes terms, wearing bright clothing, never using wine language, and the wine world absolutely hated what Gilly and I did on BBC television. To this day, I still get criticized by the old-timers in England for cheapening the world of wine. Now, I wasn't cheapening it. Gilly and I were trying to democratize it, because we looked at the world of wine, cobwebby and stale and exclusive. And I had been, as an actor, I'd been in California, I'd been in Australia, I'd been in the New World. I'd seen that good, enjoyable, juicy, attractive, cheap wine was a perfectly normal thing to expect. But in Europe, we weren't getting any of it. So I was of the opinion that if we were going to use the television show with 11 or 12 million viewers each week, and this, remember, in England, at the end of the 1960s, only 5% of people in England drank wine. In the end of the 1990s, 85% of the people in England drank wine. And it has to be something to do with the fact we managed to put it onto television. But we just thought, democratize it, take it out, make it simple. And we said, we've got to find wines that are juicy and attractive. And that's where we started with Bulgaria. And we very quickly moved into Australia, New Zealand, Chile, Argentina, South Africa. Why? Because all of these people were actually saying, hey, we want to be part of your market. We'll make something that you want to drink. It's this whole idea of making something that you want to drink and making it simple to understand. Because the Germans always had the problem that the better the wine got, the more incomprehensible the label became. So you just thought, unless I've got a degree in German, I haven't the slightest idea what this wine is. And the French wines became more and more Domaine de this, that, and the other, and Château Léoville, de Bellegarde, de la Caprice, Appellation, Premier, Deuxième, Troisième, Côte, something like that. You just say, I don't know, no idea what it's like. What's the most basic thing in the wine? What's the most basic thing in the flavor? It's the grape variety. Grape varieties are just as different as apples. If we did certainly in English terms, let's say, I'm not sure which your most popular apples are in Bulgaria, but in English terms, if we had a Cox's Orange Pippin, a Golden Delicious, and I don't know, a Pink Lady, if we shut our eyes, I bet everyone in this room could tell which apple was which. Now, grape varieties, it's the same. If you've got a Sauvignon Blanc, if you've got a Chardonnay, if you've got a Riesling, that's three extremely different styles of grape. The first thing that the audience want to know is, what basic style am I looking for? What's the grape variety? If you've got a Pinot Noir, it's always going to be different from a Cabernet Sauvignon. Simple. What nobody was doing until you guys started doing it was putting the grape variety on the label. And that became one of the defining things about the New World approach. In most of the French appellations, you're not allowed to put the grape variety on the label. I can't say my wine is Appellation Saint-Emilion Contrôlé. By the way, it's got lots of Merlot and Cabernet Franc in it. I can't say my wine is Gevrey-Chambertin Premier Cru. And by the way, that's Pinot Noir. That's the grape. Just to help you out, can't say that. The New World approach is basically make it easy for the members of the public to actually enjoy the wine there. Make it easy to understand the label. Put my name, put a nice painting of, there's lots of wonderful labels out in the hall I've seen in the last day or so. But just put an attractive label, put the name of the grape, put the name of the person who makes it, and say, that's where we're starting. That's the basics to start. That's New World for you. Nobody was actually doing that at all. And one just says, well, there was no popular wine culture in Northern Europe because there was no popular wine worth drinking. The New World brought that in, started by you guys, and then continued absolutely by Australia. Australia, above all, has taught the rest of the world how to make attractive, easy wine. Australian Shiraz, when I got into the wine game coming out of the theatre, there was no Australian Shiraz. Australian Shiraz, after it took over from Bulgarian Reds. In the 1990s, when Bulgarian wine changed, and I have to say, for the worse, I think it was much better in the 80s than it was in the 90s. It's now obviously a completely different animal now to what it was then. But Australia just stepped in and said, we know how to do that. And it's that whole thing. Is, what are you blokes like? We'll go and make it for you. I remember I was doing some tasting of, Muscadet or something, and thinking these are all terrible. And this hairy, oafish bloke in a nylon shirt with a big beard sidled up and he said, "Hey," and I thought, God, you haven't washed for weeks. Never mind. And he said, what are you, can I ask you a question? And he said, what do you Brits like to drink? And I just thought, anything to get rid of him, because the smell was on the strong side. He hadn't got much of a relationship with soap. But I just said, we like red wines that taste of black currants and white wines that taste of peaches. That'll be fine. And he said, and how much do you want to pay? And I went, I don't know, £3.99. That's about 8 lev. And I said, you're fine, okay. And a year later, I was tasting another range of Beaujolais, I think it was, pretty poor stuff. And this smell started coming towards me, and I turned and I said, oh, God, it's that bloody Australian again. And he said, no, don't come the raw prawn with me. He said, here, I've got something for you. He gave me a glass of red wine, and I said, bloody hell, that tastes of blackcurrant. He said, yeah, that's what you said you liked. I said, how much is that? He said, £3.99. That's what you said you wanted to pay. And he had a glass of white wine. I said, wow, that tastes of peaches. He said, yeah, that's what you said you liked. And how much is that? That's £3.99. That's what you said you wanted to pay. New World approach. He must have gone back to Australia and said, I've been up with those whinging Poms, miserable bastards up there, But anyway, we've got to sell some of this wine. We're making too much of it and we can't drink it all ourselves. Right, they like blackcurrants in the red wines. They like peaches in the white wines. They want to pay £3.99. Let's make it for them. 12 months later, there they are. That's why, to this day, in most of the Northern European markets, Australia is the biggest imported wine, because they just made what people wanted. Followed by New Zealand. New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc is a type of wine that just didn't exist before New Zealand made it in the 1980s. The first time they made New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, no one had ever made a wine as fresh, as bright, as crisp, as crunchy, as so much bursting with fruit and with greenness. I think this is one of the great things about Sauvignon Blanc. Green is one of nature's great colors. And a lot of wine people say, green means underripe. Green means raw. Green means thin. No, it doesn't. Green is the color of springtime. Green is the color when the whole world wakes up again. The leaves start coming onto the trees. The flowers start blossoming. The grass begins to grow again. Green, green, green. It's a wonderful time of the year. And green in nature doesn't mean raw. Green is just as likely to mean bright and fresh. And that's what New Zealand did. And no one had ever done it before. What happened to the world of Merlot and Cabernet, which you guys used to own? Well, Chile took it over. Chile just said, we can do that. But when you first went to Chile, the standard of wine in Chile, when I went there in the 1990s, and the standard of the wine in Chile was absolutely appalling at the beginning of the 1990s. By the end of the 1990s, they'd completely learnt about how to make decent wine because they had brought people, most of the people they brought over to teach them how to make wine were Australians. In fact, the Australians became this bunch of people called the flying winemakers, and they toured around the world because, of course, they toured Europe because Australia in the southern hemisphere has got a vintage in January and February, March maybe. Of course, in September, they've got nothing to do. So they all come over here and say, we'll teach you blokes how to make wine. And they did it in Italy, they did it in Spain, they did it in France, southern France. Southern France, which is the biggest vineyard in the world, the Midi in southern France, made 10% of all the world's wine. And probably 99% of some of the worst wine in the world came from southern France. The Australians turned up and said, you know, these grapes are all right. You're just not trying. You're not doing it properly. We'll show you how to make decent wine. And, of course, they did it. And, again, this is New World again. What does New World mean versus Old World? They brought in things like stainless steel. Stainless steel? Everybody has stainless steel. They didn't then. Stainless steel was a brand new concept when in the 1990s in places like southern France, in places like Italy, in places like Spain, in places like Portugal. Completely new concept. Why do you need stainless steel? Because cleanliness matters. And again, all the wineries in southern France, Italy, Spain, they were dirty beyond belief, and they smelt of vinegar the moment you turned up. Wine will always become vinegar if you let it. And it's a case of saying, we're letting this wine become vinegar and selling it to members of the public. Why don't we stop it becoming vinegar and see what it's supposed to taste of, the juice of the grape, fermented, clean and fresh? How do we do that? Control. And of course, Australia's a really hot place. And anything in Australia, if you let the wine ferment, it'll turn to vinegar really quickly. What they did in Australia was thinking, why are those German wines so fresh? They went to Germany and realized that the reason Germany finds it easy to make fresh wines is they pick their grapes in sort of October, and it's cold in the vineyards in October. By the time they start fermenting the wine, it's going into November. It's really cold, and this is without any help from stainless steel or anything. Big old wooden vats in Germany used to make wine which was bitingly fresh because it was so cold the vinegar couldn't start. And by the time you got to the end of the winter, you'd spent 4 or 5 months freezing, but clean. So you could bottle a wine in March or April, really fresh, and drink it and think, wow, this really tastes of fruit. The Australians said, well, how do we do that in Australia? And two things. They brought in refrigeration. And again, nowadays we think refrigeration's perfectly normal. It wasn't when I got in the wine game. It wasn't normal at all. Refrigeration, you had to have refrigeration in Australia, otherwise everything would turn to vinegar. To get refrigeration, you needed a really neutral container because all the old wood around the world was mostly absolutely riddled with disease. Stainless steel, you could clean it out every single time, completely clean it out, scrub it down, and it's as good as new, year by year by year by year. That was completely new, that idea that stainless steel was worth doing. Now, all over France, south of France was full of cooperatives which had mouldy old cellars. When the Australians came in there, they would say, if you want to, I'll teach you how to make good wine. Get rid of all that old wood. Get rid of that concrete. Although thank God they didn't get rid of all the concrete, because actually now winemakers are realizing that concrete is a really good substance to make wine in. It's the old wood was the problem. I remember when I first went to Chile, and I went there to study politics rather than to do wine, but that's another story. I went to one winery, and I met. This is 1991, 1992, and I met an ancient, he was about 95 years old, this bloke, a retired cellar master. And I looked at these enormous wooden barrels he said, and I said, how old are those? And he said, I joined this winery when I was 14 years old. He's now 95, and he said they were old when I joined when I was 14. So they probably came from the 19th century. And they stank. The whole place was riddled with vinegary smells. By the middle of the 1990s, I went back to Chile again, and I saw these great piles of wood outside these wineries. And I said, what's that? They said, these are the bonfires we're making of all our old barrels, all our old vats. We're burning the lot. And they burnt them, the lot. Enormous, day after day, fires, enormous great fires of old burning wood. Well, one might say, God, that's disgraceful. But honestly, the wood they were using was a wood called rauli. It wasn't oak. It was called rauli. And rauli is a redwood which has got a smoky kind of flavor to it. And you put the wine in rauli, you can't get rid of that flavor. So that idea of new world again, control. Nowadays, where control has got a slightly bad reputation, saying, oh, scientists do too much. We've got to let everything hang out. We've got to just let everything be free and easy. Let the wine do itself. Well, wine is all about human intervention. We can do all this natural wine business as much as you like, but if you're going to be any good, and the natural wine movement, well, it's a new movement, but natural wine was presumably being made all over Europe in the 1980s, the 1880s, the 1780s, the 1680s, and as ever, natural wine can be a really good wine if it's made by someone with talent and commitment and skill. But you simply can't just do this thing, hey babe, I want to do natural wine, it's cool, let the wine do its own thing, and I just say, look at it, let it be, oh no, don't touch it. Doesn't work like that at all. The great thing about non-intervention is you've got to have the most minute attention to detail, so that whenever you just need to go like that, just go like that, just go like that, you're doing it. That's proper natural wine. Natural wine is not just letting the thing hang out, because there's a lot of filthy wine made like that. And one of the great problems I have with people like the natural wine movement, there are one or two well-known critics who say any wine made in the traditional way that we all know is toxic. And if we drink it, we are toxic too, which I think is unmitigated nonsense. It means that basically every wine that every one of us has enjoyed in this room is regarded as toxic, and we are criminal because we enjoyed it or because we made it. It's rubbish. I remember I was with Nicolas Joly, and we were talking about natural biodynamic wines, and I tasted his wines and I thought they tasted sour and flat and dull, and I was quite clear that several of us thought exactly the same in the room. And we started saying, we'd like a little bit more fruit or a little bit this. And he just said, no. He said, I don't care what the wine tastes like, so long as I have made it in a moral way. And we just thought, you're in the wrong business. The only reason to make wine is to give people pleasure, not to actually give them a lecture on the morality of using sulfur dioxide and the lecture on the morality of using chemicals in the vineyards. But that whole world, remember when I got into this world, there was no South Africa either. Another place, no Argentina. Argentina has only been a modern wine country in the last 15, 20 years. It's as recent as that. I remember I went down to South Africa once in the 1990s, and they'd organized a tasting match against Australia, and Australia walloped South Africa. And I was doing a television show trying to say why the Australians had won. Not you've got to make Australian wines, but trying to say this is why they won, and you could learn something from them. And eventually, an enormous great bear. South Africans are really big. No wonder they win at sports a lot, because they're big. And this purple-faced bloke couldn't stand it anymore, and he marched to the front, and he poked me like that. He said, "Don't you come down here with your pinko ways, trying to make us make Australian wine. We have been making wine since 1659. And I just thought, well, you haven't learned much, have you? But they were, again, really recent into the New World again. What brought them into the New World? The realization that they have an entirely new generation of winemakers. They have some of the youngest winemakers in the world. They've got an absolute incursion of women winemakers. 30 years ago, there probably wasn't a single female winemaker in South Africa. Now there's about the same number of women as there are men. And it makes a massive difference in a society like South Africa, which has been repressed beyond belief. Suddenly, the wine world is one of the great, great ways to actually let everybody express themselves and draw in this world of liberalism. Liberalism has got a bad name at the moment, but liberalism traditionally ought to mean just the chance for everyone to have an idea of their own. It's nothing to do with the neoliberalism of American politics and God knows what. It's just the general idea of we're all in this together. What do you think? What do you think? What do I think? Let's discuss it. That was never done in South Africa 30 years ago. That was never done in Argentina 25 years ago. That was never done in Chile 30 years ago. That's absolutely part of the new world. And that, I'm sure, is what you guys now are doing in Bulgaria. Listening to each other, tasting each other's wines, seeing why do you think that's better? Why do you think that's better? What can I do to improve my stuff? All of that kind of world. But the world I came into again, what didn't we have? Well, the grape varieties that we now know, which I'd never heard of when I started into wine. I put a few down. Assyrtiko, never heard of it. It's now a really trendy wine from Greece. Greek wine was filthy when I came in. They had a wine called Domestica. It sounded like a bleach that you should have used to clean out the toilet, and frankly, it would have done the job fairly well. The other wine they had was Retsina, which is wine with resin added into it. Actually rather nice on a beach in the middle of summer with a pile of Tara Maslata about that high. It worked fine. But Greece now has got some of the most exciting dry white wines in the whole of Europe. Didn't have a single wine worth drinking when I started. Albarino. Albarino is now a really successful grape variety from Spain. When I started, there wasn't a single Spanish white wine that anyone would ever want to drink. I remember talking to Miguel Torres about his attempt to invent modern white wine in Spain with a wine called Viña Sol, which you probably know. And he said, there's no point, he said, no one in Spain wants to drink a fresh white wine. They want their wine to be yellow. So that's what we got. Things like Saperavi. Saperavi now is regarded as a really exciting grape variety. Never heard of it before. Grüne Veltliner. Well, Austria. Austria is now one of the most important wine producers in the country. In 1985, they had a scandal whereby people added some antifreeze to the wine and then sold it to a big German company to sell in Germany. No one died. Antifreeze doesn't kill you. I mean, I've tried it. you shove some on your tongue, doesn't really taste of anything either. And then actually suddenly your whole mouth fills with some kind of thick richness. That just one tiny bit on your tongue. So it just makes the wine seem fatter. But Grünerfeldliner, we'd never heard of it. In fact, the only wine that was exported from Austria was a wine called Schluck, which we used to think, yuck, Schluck, muck was the general feeling that we had about Schluck. That's all they exported. Now, Austria is one of the greatest wine producers in the world. What about Furmint? Never heard of Furmint. Never. In Hungary's great white grape. Never heard of it. Touriga Nacional. Never heard of it. Nobody knew what Touriga Nacional was. Shiraz. Nobody knew what Shiraz was. When I got into the wine world, nobody knew what Shiraz was. It's completely bizarre. We'd never heard of any of those sort of grapes. And let alone things like the Peewees, these new grape varieties now, which we're all developing to try and deal with climate change. None of those. I mean, hey, we probably hadn't heard of most of those 12 months ago, let alone when I got into the world of wine. And the areas, Santorini, never heard of it. Rias Baixas, never heard of it. Toro, Ribera del Duero, world famous Spanish place. There was only one Ribera del Duero in those days called Vega Sicilia. That's the only one there was. There wasn't a denominación for Ribera del Duero. They sold their grapes to Rioja, and they made them they sold them as Rioja. Things like the Burgenland, the Wachau in Austria, never heard of them. But more than that, what about Marlborough? When I got in the world of wine, there was no Marlborough. Marlborough didn't exist. Barossa existed, but no one had ever heard of it. Sonoma County, Sonoma Coast. The Sonoma Coast didn't have a single vine when I got into it. The Uco Valley in Argentina, no one had ever heard of it. Limeri, Casablanca, places like that in Chile, didn't have a single vine. It's the difference now is absolutely remarkable, and all of those places, they have been planted with vines with the purpose to make wines which please us, which give pleasure, which give joy. And that is a very, very modern thing. The European way has often been, we make wine because it's actually safer to drink than water. And frankly, in France, when I was a kid, it was cheaper than water. You could buy a litre of wine for less money than a litre of water. So, and I'm not entirely sure it was safer than the water, but that's because the wine was so bad in those days. But what has happened, and I must say I've been really lucky to just move in this wonderful world of wine while it's been changing to such an extent. Simple things like screw caps now, or Diam corks. Technically, any one of us in this room should be able to offer wines with 100% guarantee that there is no taint in the wine. If we want to, we can do it. We could offer 100% guarantee. But I remember in about 2000, I was down in the Clare Valley, judging wine in the Clare Valley in Australia. We were sending back between 30 and 40% of the wines because they were tainted with cork. 2001, I was down in Marlborough in New Zealand. We were sending back 40% of the wines because they were tainted with cork. Michael Brajkovic at Kumeu Valley, which is a great New Zealand wine producer, he took a whole pallet of wine off and took it back to his winery, opened up every bottle on a pallet of wine. 40% of the wines that he was just about to send off to the export market tainted with cork. That's when New Zealand said, we've had enough of this. We're going to screw cap. Clare Valley in Australia said, we are too. And what's interesting is Tesco is the biggest supermarket group in England. They said, it's not often the biggest supermarket group does something really good. It's normally they do something really bad. But they said, we actually are going to support screw cap and try and persuade our producers to use screw cap. And it made a massive difference. Within very short time, 35% of the wines in Tesco were in screw cap. The idea of cork taint, which of course used to be called terroir. Terroir. It is terroir. No, it's not. It's cork. Honestly, I hope there aren't any French sommeliers in the room, because French sommeliers sometimes don't do themselves any favors. I remember I was with Dominique Lafont, who makes wonderful Meursault, and his importer, and I said, let's go and have a bottle of wine. So we went to this wine bar, and I said, can we have a bottle of the Meursault, please? And we said, no, c'est bouchonné. It's corked. And so I said to the wine waiter, sorry, this is corked. And he went, no, it's not. I said, yeah, it's corked. Can I have another bottle? He said, it's not corked. I said, I think it's corked. I'd like another bottle. He said, you cannot have another bottle. And I went, okay. I tell you what, I'd like to buy a second bottle of this wine. No, you cannot buy a second bottle. There's nothing wrong with this bottle. And eventually I said, I want another bottle of this wine. He said, you can't. I said, fine. Do you mind if I just introduce you? This is the person who imports this wine into the country. This is the person who made this wine. Now get us another bloody bottle. And it was this thing, oh, it's terroir. They don't understand terroir. The word terroir has hidden a multiplicity of ills over the years. But nowadays with screw cap, there are other ways to taint wine. But when it comes to the closure, we should never really have tainted wine. Any serious wine producer should never have tainted wine ever again. But another thing that is so different now is ripeness. And of course, ripeness goes down to climate change. And climate change is actually, I've just looked at my watch. I've been talking too long. Just to talk a minute or two about climate change, because the last time that the world was this warm was 115,000 years ago. That's the last time it was this warm. The last time we had this much carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was 4 million years ago. So that's way before any kind of human activity was going on, and there must have been some enormous volcanic eruptions and things that used to go on in those old days. But the very reasonable scientists have said that if we go on warming at the rate we're warming at the moment, up to 73% of the vineyards in places like the Mediterranean, the Black Sea, and also in places like Australia, South Africa, Argentina, 73% of those areas will be too hot for vines to survive by 2050, if we go on as we are at the moment. Because we all talk about climate change, we all talk about global warming. The one bunch of people who don't seem to want to do anything about it is the political leaders. They just don't. And until America and China and India, those three, above all, until those three start taking climate change seriously, it's just going to get warmer and warmer and warmer. And they reckon that if we get 4 degrees centigrade warmer, which is entirely possible at the moment, over 85% of the vines in the world will just die. It just won't be possible. And the vine is a really, really adaptable thing. As you've all noticed in your 2024 vintage, which is, some people have been telling me, is a month earlier this year than normal. In areas, and the vine has adapted, and you have actually been able to make good wines from them. But there's only so long you can go on adapting and adapting and adapting and adapting. And if you look at what's happened, 2023, for instance, 2023 was the hottest year ever around the world. In the week of July the 24th, 2023, the record for the hottest day ever was broken 3 times in 1 week. And that was just a year ago. Now, I would say that it's entirely likely, from what you've been telling me about this year in Bulgaria, it may well be that the ripening season in Bulgaria this year was the hottest there's ever been. Entirely possible. In Northern Europe, where September and October are more important. The 10 hottest Septembers ever have been in the last 20 years. And the 10 hottest Octobers ever have been in the last 20 years. So the trouble is, it's climate chaos. Because in 2023, hottest year ever up till now, South Africa, for instance, had its worst floods for 108 years. Greece had 3 years' rain in 2 days. And this is in the hottest year ever. And this year, Valencia flooded, Girona flooded, Portugal, towns inundated. In August, the Danube was bursting its banks further upstream. And yet the year before, 2022, the Rhine and the Danube was so low that the barges couldn't operate. There wasn't enough water. The Po River, the biggest river in Italy, was so low that the Mediterranean was coming back up, and salt was coming up the Po Valley and getting into all the irrigation systems. Venice was the lagoon in Venice was drying out to such an extent that there weren't any vongole. For the spaghetti alla vongole, you couldn't have spaghetti alla vongole. There weren't any vongole. The Swiss couldn't make Gruyere cheese because the cows had no grass. It was too hot. The grass had just shriveled. In Portugal, they couldn't make any cork last year because it was so dry that the cork trees, if we take the cork off the cork trees, the trees will die. It's happening all around us. Now, the vine is wonderfully adaptable. Wine makers and vine growers are wonderfully adaptable. But it's something we really need to take seriously. When we think that I go down to Burgundy to taste wines, I taste Vosne Romanés at 16.3% alcohol. I taste Gevrey Chambertins at 15.5% alcohol. I've tasted Burgundy samples at nearly 20%. You say, how can this be possible? The yeast must die. They say, we've measured it. It's nearly 20% alcohol. In Vosne Romanée, there are 2 people already in Vosne Romanée who've planted Malbec. It's not legal. There are 2 people in Vosne Romanée who've planted Malbec because they're just saying to themselves, we've got to do something about climate change. Syrah is being planted in Burgundy and in Beaujolais. Roussanne and Marsanne are being planted. It should just be Chardonnay. But the Chardonnays are all coming in at 14.5%, 15% alcohol. So they're planting Roussanne and Marsanne. And in England, we bring in Pinot Noir in England at 14.7% alcohol in England. What is the world coming to when England makes wine at 14.7% alcohol? Well, I reckon that that's probably about all we've got time for. And of course, as I said, you should never talk in public for longer than you can make love. Thank you. So what did you bring me? If you got time.
Ако имате някакви въпроси, 2-3, можем да... Някой?
Why it's Oz from Robert?
Sorry?
Why Oz when it's Robert?
Because I'm actually Welsh, Irish, English. And my name is Owen. Not Oz at all. But you guys don't play cricket, do you? Anyone play cricket here? I play cricket like an Australian, which means basically anytime you play cricket like that normally, but Australians bowl at your head. So that's how you play cricket like an Australian. Bowl at my head, I hit you over there. Bowl at my head again, I hit you over there. And I was just called Aussie at school because I hit them over there to the boundary, and all the other boys were like this, and normally the ball was hitting them on the head, and they were in hospital by 4:30 in the afternoon. I hit them to the boundary, they called me Aussie, and it stuck. And frankly, I'm happy with it. My mother isn't. She called me Oz once, and I said, Mummy, please never again call me Oz. All right, I won't. Robert. She calls me Robert.
More questions?
What's in your opinion on the new trend, talking about wines made by the Dutch, wines made by Norway? Are they a favorable candidate for, making fine wine in the future during, all the things that we're looking at climate change-wise?
If you want to look at this climate change thing seriously, England is the most glowing example. The sparkling wine in England now is at least as good as most champagne. And except for the very top champagnes, the sparkling wine in England is better. It's any commercial brand, you'll find 20 wines in England which are better than the commercial brands. And next year you'll find 30, and the year after you'll find 40. So sparkling wine, of course, the landscape in southern England is exactly the same soil as in Champagne. It's called the Paris Basin. It's a ring of limestone and chalk around Paris. And of course, southern England, and the English Channel is only about 10,000 years old. It all used to be one land mass. And the soil in southern England is exactly the same soil as in Champagne and Chablis. So that works. Holland has been making good wine for years now, down towards Maastricht. And in fact, Holland and Belgium, they've got the only appellation which spreads over two countries. I think it's on the Meuse, or is it the Meuse or the Elbe? Probably the Meuse. And they've got an appellation which is Belgian on one side and Dutch on the other side, making very nice sparkling wine, very good Pinot Gris. In Sweden, there are well over 100 vineyards now in southern Sweden, around the Skåne area. It's really nice down there. It's the breadbasket of Sweden, making lots of good white wines and some reasonably good red wines. In Norway, Norway can actually make Cabernet Sauvignon, and you think, how on earth is that? Well, they do get a bit of the Gulf Stream coming in Norway, but Norway's got something like 50 vineyards, something like that, and making really very pleasant white wines. Finland's got a winery. Well, it's next to a nuclear power station, which helps, of course, in that presumably it's a bit warmer most of the time than it is another half a kilometre away. But even Finland makes wine. Until the Gulf Stream will presumably stop, when the Gulf Stream stops, because when we lose the snow cover on the Arctic, the Gulf Stream, which goes like this down to the Gulf of Mexico and back up, it's a conveyor belt of warm water coming up from the Gulf Stream, which has to have an extraordinarily cold bit at the top to make the conveyor belt work, to convect like that. We will, unless again, nature plays wonderful tricks, and it may be that nature works out how to keep the Arctic ice cap. It might be that nature does it. If it doesn't, we will lose the extraordinarily cold, salty water around the North Pole. The Gulf Stream will stop, and that means that the temperature of the water off the coast of Western Europe will drop by about 6 to 7 degrees centigrade. You can see that in the Faroe Islands. On the left-hand side of the Faroe Islands to the west, the water is 7 degrees warmer than it is only a few kilometers on the right-hand side. Somewhere like Ireland, if you go to Cork in Ireland, West Cork you can swim all year round. It's nice and gentle, warm water. Just 30 kilometers round East Cork, it's absolutely freezing, even at the height of summer. That's the difference, which will mean that global warming at the moment is going to, the Atlantic's warming up, the Mediterranean's warming up. This is why we're getting all these rainstorms. It means that we're getting wetter and wetter conditions. Everyone talks about global warming, saying, oh, sunny days all the time. It's all this heat, all this sun. It's also all this rain, because the prevailing winds are mostly in Western Europe. They're all coming in from the Atlantic. It's getting hotter and hotter. They're coming in from the Mediterranean, and your prevailing winds here, would they be from the west or would they be from the Black Sea? But if they're from the Black Sea, it'll be warming up in the Black Sea as well, bringing in more rain every time those come in. So if the Gulf Stream stops, it won't affect the sunshine. We'll probably have we might have more sunshine, but it'll be much colder and much drier. Do any of you know Blade Runner, the wonderful film? How in that futuristic world of Blade Runner, it's completely, the world is covered with cloud, and it's always raining. It's a hot, humid, rain-filled world. It never stops raining. And that's a doomsday possibility with climate change, just more and more water evaporating, and it's got to come down again, and it comes down on us as rainstorms. So I think in the short to medium term, places like Denmark makes pretty good Chardonnay, England certainly, Holland, Belgium, all of them can make very good wines, really nice wines. And if you like those lighter, leaner, more delicate styles of wine, they're fantastic places to do it. Southern Poland is making some pretty good wine at the moment. In the short to medium term, it may well be, if climate change isn't dealt with in the longer term, we're just going to get wetter and wetter and wetter, and it's going to become tropical all over the place. And in the tropics, you can't grow grapes.
Да благодарим на Оз Кларк. Аплодисменти.